As the feminization of our society continues to grow, men are becoming increasingly lost. But why are they not turning to the church for answers? And why are especially young men more drawn to unchristian men like Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, Joe Rogan, and many more? So does the Bible have what men need on this slice of fresh bread? Welcome to Fresh Bread, podcast ministry of Grace Bible Church, Gainesville, with Pastor Brandon and Pastor Keith. Well, hi everyone. Welcome to Fresh Bread, podcast 30. Fresh Bread, where we're bringing the truth of God's Word to a starving world. And I'm Pastor Keith, and that's Pastor Brandon. You know, a worldview of men is that a man needs to be self-reliant. He needs to hide their emotions. And we can also have what they call the cowboy view of a man, which is, I don't need anybody. I can do it myself. Men are lost. They're searching for their identity, their self-worth. So we see that men are lost, and they're trying to find the answers. And again, why are they not turning to the church? Pastor Brandon, men are lost, but why are they not turning to the church for answers? What say you?
Well, I could only go back to my own experience becoming a Christian. I mean, one of the struggles that I had personally becoming a Christian was that it felt like that Christianity was, there was a feminine aspect to Christianity. You know, and it's interesting, full disclosure in that sense is that was one of the things that really I struggled, in terms of how I loved Christ. For me, there was this sense of, it was kind of ooey gooey and like this thing that just didn't resonate with me. What resonated with me was being masculine, and doing masculine things, and the church wasn't providing that for me. And so, I think when early as a Christian, that was a struggle for me.
Can you define masculinity? In my mind, I understand what you're saying because I've heard that before too, and I'm trying to think if I went through that, because there is a lot of hugging and a lot of, there's a holy kiss. I mean, you could do that in some churches as well, but men don't.
Keith, I don't want a holy kiss from you.
No, but I grew up. I didn't grow up in a church. I grew up in a Lutheran church that didn't hug, but
Sure.
There are churches that you hug, and I do it now just instinctively because you're so glad to see people. And is that the kind of thing that you're saying?
Well, actually, what I'm saying is that the idea that Jesus is my girlfriend. That you listen to these Christian songs and you could literally, in many of them, you could take Jesus and replace Jesus with with your boyfriend, and that's Jesus. That he's become more the boyfriend as opposed to who he truly is. And that's what that's one of the things I struggled with. I didn't necessarily don't get me wrong, I will say that I'm not naturally a hugger. I'm not naturally that way. And so I probably did struggle in that way in the church, at first, but it wasn't so much that. It was a feminine Jesus. It was a Jesus that appealed to women more than Jesus appealed to men. And it's because Jesus, again, that whole, just think about the songs that are out there in popular Christian music. It's all about, Jesus is, the love of my life. And well, that you could replace Jesus with, your boyfriend's name, and it basically is the same song. And it's not, I don't think that's the biblical Jesus.
Right. And you think part of that is on a lot of the movies and those mini series. I'm thinking of Jesus of Nazareth and some of these other ones that have come out, that they do always kind of portray Jesus as this little kind of, I don't want to say wimpy guy, but he's always crying.
Soft.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that, you think that's part of it too?
I think, yeah, probably. The church has not done a good job in my lifetime. The church has not done a good job of appealing to, men in where they're at in terms of understanding men. And most churches have more women than men. And, I think there's a reason for that. The men they're not finding what they're looking for in the church.
And that's a whole question we could ask, is whose fault is that? Is that the pastors of the church, or is it just that men have no one to guide them? Like there is no...
Well, I think that, the destruction of the family is certainly added to that, because there, men, where have all the good men gone kind of question. And, a lot of them are in corporate America. They're out slaying dragons and, in their jobs, and they're, in sports and, doing that sort of thing. And they've kind of pulled away from, the traditional, like being a husband, being a father. Most men nowadays grow up without a father. They don't have a father figure in their life. And it's because men have, exited those areas. And part of it's because of how we're treating men in the culture. We're not valuing manhood. We're not valuing being a husband. We're not valuing being a father. You look at comedies, and you look at these sitcoms, and what's the picture of the father in the sitcoms? He's a bumbling idiot that doesn't know anything, and that everybody's always kicking around, and that's been the sitcoms for the past 40 years. And so now, we're reaping what we're sowing in that sense, because men are exiting those areas. And some men are even saying, why am I going to get married? Why would I subject myself to these things? Why would I put myself in a position of giving up half my wealth, my livelihood, to get married? It's not even worth anything. So, in terms of how they're viewing it.
Do you think that started? I'm trying to take it back to where all this began. If we look at movies, even back in the 30s and 40s, you have Clark Gable and Humphrey Bogart, guys like that. So men kind of looked up to them, and then now you bring in John Wayne. These are what men are like, and it's hard to picture them in a church singing hymns.
Well, yeah, I mean that's exactly right, and that's kind of what I was saying. Is I grew up with John Wayne. I grew up with Clint Eastwood. I grew up with these men who the world was shaping up. I mean, they smoked Marlboros, and they rode horses, and they fought, and they played with guns, and they did all these things that were considered manly. And you get in the church, and it's completely different. And don't get me wrong, it should be different. I mean, that's a worldly view of manhood. That's a wrong view of manhood. John Wayne does not represent true biblical manhood. Neither does Clint Eastwood. So those were wrong as well. Here's the problem: is that we're not getting our picture of what a man should be from Scripture. We're getting it from the culture, and it's driving our view of manhood. And so, yeah, I mean, in the 50s and 60s, it was John Wayne and dashing men, and that were strong and tough and masculine, and but then it became the Marlboro Man was there. I mean, in terms of getting guys to smoke, but then somewhere along the line it changed. This pendulum swung, and then all of a sudden it became the bumbling idiot. We're going to make fun of men, and now all of a sudden we're gonna raise up, and we're going to elevate feminism, that sort of thing, and the strong woman. But what we have to recognize is, whether you're on one end of the pendulum or the other, it's not biblical manhood. We're looking to the wrong sources to understand what men and women, what their role should be.
I wonder if that began in the 1970s, that, because through the 50s, there were still men that were strong men and on television represented as the father. And we get into the 70s, and you've got Archie Bunker, and young people aren't going to know who these people are, but Archie Bunker and All in the Family became the first kind of bumbling conservative goofball that they shown, and then ever since that, it's been going that direction.
Yeah, well, Archie Bunker was probably at the beginning of that, and so then you move forward, and you have that same thing that was successful becomes successful as a formula going up, and you making fun of men.
The 40s, you had the great generation, right? The men that fought in World War II.
Yes,
these guys came back, and these were real men.
Sure.
I mean, they were kids fighting in World War II, and they came back, started families, and had kids. And I mean, I always looked up to those guys.
Yeah, and they wanted to make life better for their kids. So the problem is that you end up with, you have this generation of men who are hardened by war. They've seen war. They want to come back, and they want to make life better for their kids. But the problem is that they insulate them from the things that really made that generation what it was. And because the things that were hard is what made them who they were. So they came back and they had children, and they began to insulate their children from those things because they're harsh realities. But the problem is that made a soft generation. The generations that are coming after, that came after those men, became softer and softer and softer till we get to where we are today, which basically we're grappling for what even a man is.
Would it also be included the feminization of our society?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that's what happens. What we have to recognize is that the reason why the society can be feminine is because somewhere along the lines, men fought the battles to get to the point where that women can be raised up in that way. But the problem is that as it goes along, you're going to end up putting yourself in a position where that's going to happen again, where those bad things that happen, where evil creeps in. And that's what's happening, is that evil is creeping in because the society is getting softer and softer and more feminized and more feminized. And so eventually that's going to, evil is going to overtake. You're going to have the same problems again in terms of what led to things like World War II, that sort of thing. So
we had these great men in the 40s. Now we have men growing up who are looking for that kind of masculinity, and the church isn't giving it to them.
Yes. I mean, I think that's what we have to recognize, is that even the 40s, we put that generation on a pedestal. I mean, that it's not like I don't think we should say or think that they somehow were biblical. I mean, because that's really what the issue is. I mean, is that in all of this, it's a departure from biblical manhood. I mean, that's why there's this pendulum that swings back and forth between, ultra masculinity and then femininity. And so in terms of what's happening in the culture, I think the pendulum swings is because we're looking for what is a true man. What does a true man look like? But we're looking for it in all the wrong sources. We're looking for it in all the wrong places. And we're putting people and we're putting things on a pedestal. But what we have to recognize is what is big today may not be big tomorrow. The pendulum may swing back the other direction. Unfortunately, when the pendulum swings, that's when I would argue people get hurt when the pendulum swings. And that's what I'm concerned about even today, and some of the things that we're seeing in the culture. Is that, you asked the question and, in our lead in, about men like Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, Joe Rogan. I mean, they're representing some voices out there, some voices that are saying things that are more masculine. But what I'm concerned about is it ends up being a reaction against the culture that ends up taking us too far the other direction. I preached yesterday, and I think part of what brought this up was even that the idea of mercy. The Romans they hated that idea, to be a merciful man, to be have mercy. And they hated that as an idea. And what I'm concerned about is that the pendulum swinging back the other direction, and we end up with a certain type of brutal masculinity that ends up, basically being a dominating masculinity that isn't a biblical masculinity either. Ultimately, the issue is more in the church and what's happening in the church. So, you have this feminization of the church that's happened. And so what I'm concerned about is that there are people that are men that are searching, and they're looking for what biblical masculinity is, or they're looking at what masculinity is, and they're finding it in guys like Jordan Peterson. They're finding it in guys like Joe Rogan. They're finding it in guys like Andrew Tate. They're finding it in guys like Jocko Willink that, while those guys have some good things that they're saying, their foundation isn't biblical.
I'm not as familiar with these men. I've heard some of them, what they've said, but I don't follow whatever they're saying. But whatever it is, it's resonating. So maybe we need to can you define like a worldly masculinity as opposed to a godly masculinity?
I mean, a worldly masculinity would be to elevate, masculine traits such as justice, not having mercy, that not.
So you just kind of walk over everybody.
Yeah,
to get what you want.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of Jordan Peterson he uses lobsters as his. Basically, the idea is that there's this hierarchy of dominance, and so lobsters approximate that hierarchy of dominance. And so, like if a lobster gets beaten by another lobster, they actually become less dominant because they've been beaten. And so this other lobster, the more he wins, the more dominant he becomes in the hierarchy. And so it ends up being this idea that I can become masculine by winning battles, by fighting. And I think that's why it's, it like Joe Rogan, is a former fighter and still
Isn't
is
that what
involved.
Tate is too? Isn't he?
Yeah,
next?
Tate's a former fighter, and I think even amongst the young guys fighting, MMA, this ultimate fighting stuff is really popular amongst young men because that's that they elevate that kind of thing, and so those kind of traits get elevated, and unfortunately, what happens is that that some men take it further than others, right? Some of the things that they're saying, I think they're good. That we do need men to be more like men, and I think it's a good message. The problem is that you're always going to have people who take it to the extreme, and the extreme is going to be let's dominate women, let's make women subservient to us, and we don't. That's not biblical manhood. Biblical manhood has nothing to do with being dominant. It has nothing to do. We need to be able to protect. Is probably a better way to put that. Let's be able to protect those who are in our protection. Let's be men in that way. But when I glorify that stuff, that's the problem. When I begin to glorify fighting, when I begin to glorify being dominant and climbing this dominance hierarchy, being dominant in whatever field that I'm in, and taking down all people who are challenging me. That's not biblical manhood.
Yeah, it's almost like we talked about John Wayne. I tend to think that's that's what it is to be a man. You fight your battles. If physical, fighting was always a part of when I grew up. Boys just did that, right? We would fight and I'm not saying it's bad, because sometimes I think boys just need to fight it out. And once they get it out, it releases whatever it was inside of them that they needed to get out.
You see these young men probably for various reasons they have all this pent up anger, and they have all that this anger builds within them. And there is a genius to, being able to fight it out. And it's because your aggression has been taken out, and now you can get past that. And unfortunately, I think that a lot of these kids are not able to do that, not able to have that aggression, and so even things like football are being taken away from these kids because nobody wants them to get hurt. You don't want them to have get a concussion, and that's not the subject of this podcast, but it is. That is problematic, because God has made us He's made boys more aggressive. And there has to be an outlet for those things. And I know that isn't necessarily the most popular thing to say, and maybe not even the most popular thing to say in the church, but that is true, that boys need that outlet for aggression. And whether you believe it's right to give a couple of boys boxing gloves and let them get after it. That was the whole thing, is giving boys this outlet for aggression. That's football is a great way to, even basketball can have those aspects of being able to get at that aggression out. And so, yeah, I think that we're losing those things in our society. And unfortunately, what's happening is that because there's no outlet in a good way, there's no outlet in a controlled way. Now a lot of these boys are going to outlets that are unhealthy, for sure.
And there's something about fighting with someone and then shaking hands when it's over happens, and you're no longer an enemy, but like you said, you've gotten it out. Does the worldly masculinity, is it right on the border of, I always look at bullying, being a bully. I think we've all dealt with bullies in school, and those were usually the guys that they're the alpha males. They're the masculine guys. It's usually masking something.
Sure, it's masking fear and weakness.
Yeah.
There's a sense that they're not good enough, and they're trying to show that they're good, that they are, and they're using aggression and taking advantage of those weaker than them, and but that's not true masculinity.
Right.
That's a caricature of masculinity. And what I'm arguing is that the reason why society is groping in these ways, and the reason why men are groping in these ways, is they're trying to understand true masculinity. And you ask, about the church. That's where the church, I think, is failing, because we're not teaching what true masculinity really is. And so the men are looking to guys that are outside the church that are saying, a lot of good things, I mean, in terms of like a Jordan Peterson. I mean, he has, as you mentioned, he has this 12 rules of life. And, the first one of them is stand up straight with your shoulders back. And, that's something that, our fathers ought to be teaching us. That's something that men, the fathers that are out there today that are bringing up their boys, and they ought to be teaching their boys to stand up straight with their shoulders back. I mean, so there's nothing wrong with that in and of itself. Now, but what's wrong is, and what the problem is that a guy like Jordan Peterson, who says that, it's his basis and it's his thesis that's wrong. In the sense, what I mean is that he uses psychology. He uses, going back to the lobsters, he uses examples like lobsters and dominance hierarchies and things like that to understand how we ought to act or interact socially. The problem is that as biblical Christians, as those who are Christians in the church, those things shouldn't be our source for understanding how we are to interact socially.
So how would Grace Bible Church, how would we define biblical masculinity, and what do we need to be doing as pastors?
Well, first and foremost, it's not a worldly understanding, but I think Christ, the Lord Jesus, is our example of biblical masculinity. He's the true example, that he embodies all of what it means to be a man. He is the complete man, and he is the perfect man, and so he's the one we ought to be looking at. Now, when I say that, let me back up and say, earlier I said the problem that I had coming into the church was that Jesus was my boyfriend mentality. So I was getting a skewed view of who Jesus is. And, Jesus is, he's the king. He's perfect man. And I need to understand and work to understand what that means and what are the implications of that, so that when I say that Christ is who we ought to be looking at, I'm talking about a right understanding of who he is.
Yeah, how do we change that, though? How do we change that image from, like what you were saying, the meek shall inherit the earth? That doesn't sound like those other guys, Rogan and those guys, are saying.
No, they're not. They're certainly not saying that. And they're not talking about mercy either. I mean, and so, we're talking about the Beatitudes at this point. I think we need to work to help people understand how those things fit into what it means to be a man. What it actually means to be a biblical Christian, what it actually means to have biblical manhood, and those things matter. The understanding what Jesus was saying when he said, "Blessed are the meek or the lowly," when he said, "Blessed are those who are merciful," what does he actually mean there, and why does it matter? I think we have to teach that, and we can't shrink back from addressing what it means to be a man in the church, but also in our culture.
If we look at examples from Scripture, let's look at Job. He suffered, and he suffered like a man.
Sure.
We have David, who went through. David was a warrior.
Sure.
And yet he had a very compassionate heart.
Sure.
And even going up into the New Testament, we have the disciples, we have Paul, all these examples of men. Why aren't more men drawn to that, do you think? Why are they more drawn to the secular cultural guys?
I think it's because how it's been interpreted, or how it's been packaged, where in the past, whatever it's been, in my lifetime, for sure, that it's been, these men have been packaged more for the soft side as opposed to more masculine aspects. David was a warrior, but he also wrote poetry. I mean, so, he
played the harp.
Yeah, he played the harp. He was the complete man in that sense. Now, obviously, he was a sinful man and he fell short of God's glory. but he did have those aspects, all the different aspects of masculinity. And I'm not saying, it's funny because can I be masculine and play the harp? Absolutely. David did, right? Can I be masculine and play the piano, or can I be masculine and write poetry? Absolutely. I mean, that has nothing to do. I think that, again, it's making sure that we don't just highlight certain aspects and make them more important than others. I mean, obviously, David was a man he had a lot of different aspects of him, and understanding that we shouldn't limit certain things, and we shouldn't limit masculinity, but we shouldn't say, well, like my father would probably have said, he probably would have looked down on on things that he would consider soft, and so because he came out of, he was a guy that came out of some of the John Wayne. He was a product of that culture, and so he would have looked down on the more softer things of life. And so, but that's not biblical Christianity. Biblical Christianity is a guy that is complete. He has all of those attributes that that we're really, Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Really looking at Christ as being the example, the model for Christianity or for manhood.
Does partly what hurts as far as young men outside of the church is that Christian men submit to a higher authority, number one, and number two, they actually are they're servants. They're serving. They love their wives. They're serving their wives. They're serving their family. Whereas the non-Christian young man would say that they should be served, that they shouldn't serve someone else, that they're a slave to no one. They don't serve anyone, that they're the main guy. They're the top dog, and everyone should serve them rather than them serve the family.
And strong, independent. Yeah. I think that it's interesting because as you were asking the question, I was thinking about that men want to go and conquer. There's this conquering idea, and I think that's why business, and I think why corporate America has been such an area where men have thrived, because they can go kill and get that pelt, and it's make money and be successful and be have glory in that. And so that's definitely something that men want and desire. And so it appeals to them in that way. And so I think that's why, I think, in the church, it's been more feminized, and it's been, men have departed from the church, and they're not they don't have those outlets that way, in that sense. And it's funny because it's interesting, because in Ephesians 6, Paul talks about, taking up the armor of God. He's using a metaphor there that's of a soldier, and this taking up the sword, and this idea of battle and fight, and and so obviously the Bible understands what appeals and what appeals to men. In terms of how the Bible was written, Paul understood that. It was a metaphor that they understood, and yet we've kind of moved away from that, and we've moved away from this idea of battling for the truth. And now, obviously, I understand Ephesians 6, and ultimately God is the warrior. Ultimately God is the one that that does the fighting for us. But at the same time, understanding that we are there as warriors for the truth, that we need to be fighting for the truth, and I think that the church has kind of moved away from that.
I know in my life, I've always thrived better if I had a really good coach or a male teacher, or someone, some male in my life that was an inspiration to me. So as we look at the church, is it the men in the church, the older men in the church have kind of let down the younger men by maybe not taking them under their wing?
Yeah, I would answer that by saying, where are they? Where are those men? And you look at the church. Where are the men who are leading the charge? and I'm not saying that they're not there at all, but a lot. I mean, in terms of when you look at a group, of men, when you look at the church, men from 25 to 45, where are they at?
Yeah.
Where are they at? They're many times they're in corporate America nowadays. I mean, a lot of them are playing video games. They're tied up in porn. They've been taken out of the church. They're not a leading part of the church, and so we're missing them. Yeah, I mean, I think the church has been hurt by that, and I think ultimately women have been hurt by that. In terms of not having men to marry. My daughter just married a young man, and I'm so thankful that they found each other. The Lord brought them together. And I'm so thankful for that. But I have another daughter that I pray fervently for a young man who can come and lead her. But, there's just so few out there. And it's ultimately because the fathers, the older men, are not leading the younger men. And it's just creating this vacuum or this void in the church in terms of men who want to be great fathers, who want to be great husbands, who want to be biblical men. That we can be all those things because that's what God calls us to be.
Well, Pastor Brandon, I made it through about half my questions, so let's end this podcast, but let's continue this discussion on manhood and biblical manhood in podcast 31. So as we end this podcast, and we'll pick it up, like I said, on the next one, you would say, and I would say too, that a biblical man is somebody that watches UFC and plays the harp and writes poetry.
I don't know about watches UFC, but I think that, someone who, a biblical man would be a guy that enjoys woodworking, that enjoys, hammering nails and enjoys, putting pipes together and building stuff, and who enjoys hunting and fishing, and maybe not all the above. I'm not saying a man has to be all those things, right? But a biblical man would also do other things, that are maybe are a little on the softer side, like music and art and being an artist or those kind of things. And so I'm not saying that all biblical men are going to watch UFC. I'm not saying that all biblical men are going to be fighters. I'm not saying all biblical men are going to be hunters or fishermen or those sorts of things. But what we have to recognize is that, God has made us, this masculine idea. And he's the one who defines what that is. And whether you're you lean toward being, an artist versus being, a plumber, it's still all in the realm of being a biblical man, biblical manhood.
Right. And I was being, with the word facetious.
Sure.
Because I'm not a UFC guy. I'm more of a KFC guy, but yeah. So
there you go. Well, KFC, there's a special place in my heart for KFC.
Oh, absolutely.
The Colonel is probably...
There's a man. That white suit when he had it.
Yeah.
You got to be a man to wear that kind of suit.
What about Dave from Wendy's?
Dave was another good guy.
Yeah. Do you think he was a man?
He wore the tie.
Was he manly?
I think he was.
Yeah.
I think he was pretty manly.
Yeah. Dave was pretty manly. Yeah. But Ronald, though.
Ronald McDonald?
Yeah.
The big
Ronald McDonald.
Floppy shoes didn't work for me.
I don't know about Ronald McDonald. If he was
well,
very,
he came out.
What about the Burger King dude?
That guy was scary. He was creepy. I'm not a big clown guy. All right, let's pick this up in podcast 31. We'll continue our discussion on manhood. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Fresh Bread, the podcast ministry of Grace Bible Church, Gainesville. For more information, go to gracegainesville.org. And thanks for listening.